All right, everybody, we're doing something a little bit different on the channel today. Instead of a first chapter Friday, we're doing a first page Friday. And instead of one story, I'm giving you 10. Keep listening to learn more. This week, I'm going to be reading to you from Guys Read Funny Business. It's a collection of stories called an anthology, and it's edited by Jon Scieszka. So these are the 10 stories that I'm going to share the first page with you, and I'm also going to tell you a little bit about each author. The authors of these short stories are so famous they won't need any introductions, but to help you make a connection to their other work, books that you likely already love, I'll tell you a little bit about each one of them. But before we get to all that funny business, I want to take a quick pause and let teachers know that I have 2 companion worksheets available that are going to go great with this video. The first one looks a lot like my regular student engagement worksheets for First Chapter Friday, but it's going to give students the opportunity to comment on whether they liked or disliked or were unsure about each of the 10 stories in this book. The second one is a text analysis worksheet. It's going to ask students how much they enjoyed the story and what specifically about the story captured their attention. On both worksheets, there's an opportunity for reflection as well. A great way to engage your students, practice their listening skills, and also their writing skills while I'm reading to them today. You can find them at Teachers Pay Teachers, and I'll make sure to put the link in the description box below. Now, let's get to Funny Business by Jon Scieszka and all his friends. First up is a story by Mac Barnett. You might recognize him from some of these covers that you see on the screen. Mac is an award-winning author, a New York Times bestselling author, and he writes specifically for children. He lives in Oakland, California, and his story is called Best of Friends. Ernest was a nerd, but it was 4th grade. We were all nerds. Even the best of us were shackled to some fatal flaw. James, who was the fastest kid in the class, was also the last one to carry a lunchbox. Jean-Pierre had already started cutting the sleeves off his gym shirts, but he hadn't yet started going by JP. Even little Tim Houston wasn't afraid to put on a French accent and say, Jean-Pierre, oui, oui, when they stood next to each other in line. And me? I was terrible at sports, last picked for everything. At recess, I hung out on the sidelines of the basketball court and bet kids quarters that they couldn't make free throws. I usually cleared a few bucks each week. It was there, on the sidelines, that I would sometimes talk to Ernest. Awkward elementary school friendships? Oh, yeah, this has all the makings for a funny story. Adam Rex is the author of our next story. He's an award-winning author and an illustrator of many humorous books for children. Some of his books have been adapted for TV. Adam used to, and still sometimes does, make art for the game Dungeons and Dragons. He lives in Tucson, Arizona. His story for the collection is called Will. Let's listen to the first page now. Between peeling off his nightclothes and pulling on his school uniform, Will examined himself from heel to hairline. Standing in front of the long mirror with a second, smaller mirror in his hand, he checked every inch of his body for marks, moles, growth, shrinkage, changes in color, and made ticks and notes on a long list in his notebook. If you had read this list, you may have found it strange. Next, he pinched himself, held his finger in the flame of a lit match, counted how many jumping jacks he could do in a minute, and timed how long he could hold his breath. When he heard the sound of his older brother moving down the hall, Will leaned out the bedroom door and stared at him, squinchy-eyed, until his brother told him to stop. Alrighty, y'all, this sounds like a kid with a few weirdo flaws like Mac was talking about himself, and you want to see why he's making these marks in his notebook and checking out his own body every day, you're going to want to keep reading this one. The next author is Eoin Colfer, and even though his name looks like Eoin, you say it Eoin Colfer. Owen has written a lot of books, probably most famously the Artemis Fowl series, and one of my favorite books by him is Global, the graphic novel. Owen was born in Ireland in 1965, where he and his 4 brothers were brought up by his parents, who were both teachers. The first story he wrote was an epic Viking adventure inspired by the history he was learning at school. Owen has sold over 25 million books that have been translated into over 40 languages. With a lineup like that and stats like that, we gotta know that this next story is gonna be great. It's called Artemis Begins. I have 4 brothers. That's 5 boys all together living in a small house, which is a recipe for major property damage at the very least. As kids, each of us had our assigned roles in the family, pretty much like the members of a boy band does today. Paul, the eldest, was the wise and reliable one. I was the aspiring writer, the bespectacled and benotebooked. Eamon was the tearaway, never without a nest of twigs in his hair and a bleeding cut on his knee. Niall was the cutie pie blonde baby. But the brother with the most interesting role, as far as an aspiring writer was concerned, was brother number 3, Donal. Donal was the young criminal mastermind. Donal has always been the fixer in our house. If someone was in trouble, Donal could get them out of it, especially if the someone in trouble was himself, and the trouble was of the kind visited on a little boy by his angry mother when the boy had totally smashed something he had expressly been forbidden to touch, on pain of death, or at the very least, no TV for a week. Donal was always touching those kinds of things and often smashing them into more pieces than there were of Humpty Dumpty, post wall tumble. What was an egg doing perched on a wall anyway? And why would all the king's horses be so upset about one egg? It all sounds suspiciously like forced rhyming to me. Donald's tried and true method for getting out of trouble was to use the fact that our mother liked him quite a bit. In fact, it could be said that she loved him lots then and still does today in spite of all the mayhem he caused in the 1980s. It sounds like Eoin is using his real life adventures for story fodder, and I, for one, definitely want to keep reading. David Lubar is up next. David grew up in New Jersey where he was often kicked out of class for talking too much. He has published over 20 books and also worked extensively as a video game designer, including Frogger 2, Super Breakout, and Carmen Sandiego. He's got a great story lined up for us called Kid Appeal. Dwight Hautzler is an idiot. He's also my best friend. Brains aren't all that important most of the time, and they're definitely not the first thing I look for when I pick my friends. For example, Zeke Walther, that motor mouth show off, is super smart, but I'd never want to hang out with him. There are lots of other things that make someone a great best friend, like loyalty and courage. Dwight's totally loyal. He'd never tell on me no matter what I did, even though he got 6 weeks of detention. Dwight never admitted he had helped me when he dumped 20 packs of cherry Kool-Aid into the school's fish pond. I swear, we thought there weren't any fish in it yet. I guess it's a good thing only 2 of them were hiding in there at a time. They looked real pretty right before they turned belly up. It was sort of like a Dr. Seuss story. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, dead fish. Oh my gosh, you guys. These characters, I gotta know what they do next. Hey, DiCamillo and Jon Scieszka co-wrote this next story in the anthology, and if I'm being honest, it's my favorite. Teachers, if you were to buy a classroom set of books, you could do a whole little mini unit just on this story alone. In fact, I might work on that for you, so stay tuned. Kate claims the title storyteller and considers herself very lucky to get to tell stories for a living. She also says that she's short, loud, and a good cook. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. John's parents came to America from Poland. He was born in Flint, Michigan, and is the second of 6 boys in his family. He has made it his mission to write books that boys like, and hopefully, with this one, he's proving himself true to that mission. Kate and John wrote a story together called Your Question for the Author Here. Real quick before we begin this story has 2 main characters, an author named Maureen O'Tuple, and then a student whose name is Joe Jones. Kate wrote the text for Maureen, and John wrote the text for Joe. So to give you a full scope of this story, we're going to read 1 letter from Joe and then 1 letter from Maureen. Dear Mrs. O'Tuple, we are reading this book in school where a kid writes to an author. So we have to write to an author. We're also studying parts of a friendly letter. So this is also a friendly letter. In the book we are reading, this kid thinks the author's books are really great, and then the author writes back and saves the kid's life or something. I'm not sure because I only read the first part of the book. Please send a bunch of author stuff so we can get this over with. Closing, Joe Jones. Here's the response letter from Maureen. Dear Joe Jones, you have reached Maureen O'Tuple. I am quite sure, however, that you have not reached her using the method your teacher suggested. Your teacher asked you to pen a friendly letter. The letter I received from you was not friendly. It was rather perfunctory. And look, I have written you a perfunctory letter in return. There's a certain symmetry to that, isn't there? Yours in the spirit of getting this over with, Maureen O'Tuple. P.S. I'm afraid I have no idea what author stuff is, therefore, I will be unable to send you any. The continuing letters that go back and forth for several letters are hilarious, and I guarantee you're going to love them. Our next contribution comes from author David Yoo. David is a teen and middle grade author who, in addition to writing books, enjoys playing soccer and video games. He lives in Massachusetts and teaches writing at Pine College and the Gotham Writers Workshop. His story is called A Fistful of Feathers. One night, in the fall of 5th grade, my dad finally got fed up with me and decided it was time to make me a man. Translation: my dad thought I was positively girly and was worried that I'd get bullied once I got to middle school the next year. He had been appalled earlier that day to see that only girls had been invited to my 11th birthday party, and that night he glared at me all through dinner as I nibbled on a tofu burger. I'd been a vegetarian since the 3rd grade when I bit into an unbelievably purpley, bloody chicken McNugget at McDonald's, before finally announcing, "That's it. I'm making you my special project, Sam. We're going to right this ship starting tomorrow." Oh no, y'all. I think that some father-son miscommunication, hijinks, and probably disasters are being set up for us in this story. Our next author probably needs no introduction, but I will give it to you anyways. It is Jeff Kinney. Jeff is an author and cartoonist and best known for creating, writing, and illustrating the children's book series Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which has sold almost 300 million copies and has been turned into a series of movies as well. He is also the creator of the website Pop Tropica. Jeff lives in Massachusetts, where he and his wife own a bookstore called An Unlikely Story. Jeff's story in this book is called Unaccompanied Minors. My younger brother Patrick is a normal, functioning adult. He has a job and a car and a house, and he's a productive member of society, which is all pretty surprising considering I'm the one who raised him. Okay, so maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. Patrick had an attentive mother and father, 2 older siblings, and a grandmother who made sure he was loved and cared for. But they couldn't always be there to look out for him. That's where I came in. Once I got to babysitting age, my folks felt like they could trust me to watch my little brother for a few hours at a time while they ran errands or took care of things for the family. The moment the car pulled out of the driveway, I went to work on my defenseless kid brother. I don't know, you guys. Do you think you'd rather be a brother in Jeff's household or in Owen's? I think I'm going to have to read both the stories fully to make my decision on that one. Christopher Paul Curtis is the next author of the next story in our book. Christopher was born in Flint, Michigan, the second author of this slideshow to do so, and did not publish his first book until he was 40 years old. Before that, he worked in a factory making cars. His first 2 books won the Newbery Honor and the Newbery Award. He now lives in Canada. The story Christopher contributed is called What? You Think You Got It Rough? My Gramps, Papa Red, has been living with us for a year now and is straight up nuts. I don't say that because the man can't understand anything that was invented after the wheel either. I say that because one day I'm going to be a writer and I've trained myself to be real observant. As part of doing research for my upcoming autobiography, I've read a bunch of issues of modern psychology, and now, instead of wanting to knock Papa Red the mess out, I understand that he can't help himself. The magazines say it's all understandable why he lost his mind. It's because of his father, Iron John, a man who was so far off the deep end, he was at the bottom of the ocean. These sound like super interesting characters, and I definitely am going to want to read more. How about you? Our next story comes from writer Paul Feig. In addition to writing, Paul is a filmmaker, actor, and comedian. Guys Read Funny Business is his only book for kids, but he has worked on a few movies and shows that might be familiar to you. You'll have to tell your parents about him because I bet they'll be able to recognize his movies once they Google him. Paul lives in Los Angeles, California. His story is titled, My Parents Give My Bedroom to a Biker. Let's listen in. This all started because I wouldn't take out the trash. Now, before you go judging me, I just want to make it clear that I'm not the kind of lazy kid who's bad or hates to be useful around the house. I've helped my mom vacuum and my dad clean out the garage so many times I should get some kind of gold medal from the President of the United States. I've heard them tell our relatives on several occasions that I'm a good son. I'm the only kid I know who actually likes broccoli and eats it at every meal. Even my teachers say I'm pretty polite and responsible and always get my homework in on time. Well, except for once when our neighbor's dog escaped and attacked me when I was waiting at the bus stop with my science project. And since it was a moldy bread experiment, the dog actually did eat my homework. This is interesting. We got to see where it goes. But I'm not going to give you the rest. You're going to have to pick up the book and check it out. Our last and final author is none other than Jack Gantos. Jack writes books for readers of all ages. His middle grade memoir, Dead End in Norvelt, won the Newbery Award in 2012. He used to spy on his teacher during lunchtime and write down notes in a diary. Jack is still writing books and also teaching others how to write them. His story is called The Bloody Souvenir. My mother was right. I was not my own man. I was a spineless follower, just as she had always said. I was a boy who was easily led astray. I liked hanging around with dangerous kids who were full of insanely feral ideas that ended in disaster. And I felt lucky that we had recently moved next door to the two most dangerous guys in the world, the Pagoda Brothers. Frankie was skinny, innocent looking kid who was my age, even though he was covered with about 100 years worth of bruises. We were in the same sixth grade class, so I didn't see him much because he mostly only showed up for lunch and to take his afternoon nap in the puke smelling nurse's office. Gary Pagoda was in the eighth grade, but I was never really sure of his age. Maybe he was 15 or 18 or even 20. It was impossible to tell. He had a lot of scar tissue on his face. When I looked at his mouth full of chipped teeth, I thought he might even be 25. But when you consider how he behaved, he might just have been a supersized 6-year-old psychopath. One thing I did know is that he had already been to prison. The other thing I knew was that I was vastly jealous that I also hadn't been to prison, because that is where he got most of his manly facial wounds and body tattoos, which my mother said were too rude for the naked eye. Oh my gosh, you guys. Where is this going? What is happening? If you've read any of Jack's other books, we might have a better clue. But that brings us to the end of our 10 funny business stories today. I hope you laughed along with them. I hope I have enticed you enough to pick up this book. And even if you don't read all of the stories in them, you read a couple that you marked down as worth revisiting. Thanks so much for stopping by my channel, Learning with the Word Nerd. I hope you come back again for more great content like First Chapter Fridays, Brain Break, direct instruction videos, and more. I'll see you again next time. Happy reading.